we are going to talk about end-of-life issues. So, who do you suppose is the most vulnerable when we're talking about life issues? Obviously, the elderly. That comes to mind right away. We think of the person who, the 110-year-old person whose health is failing, and that's the natural the natural person that we think of right away. But we're also talking about people who are the sick and dying, people with cancer, with other illnesses, and they certainly are concerned about end of life. But there's also the disabled that we need to be thinking about, that people with various disabilities, they are absolutely in the crosshairs of this discussion. And so we need to be thinking about the disabled, the mentally ill as well. As we get to more of a utilitarian thought about people, what is their utility? And as we become more and more secular in our society and in our viewpoint about life, this is certainly a concern as well. We have a little scripture from 2 Corinthians 1 through 4, or 1 verse 4. He comforts us whenever we suffer. That is why whenever other people suffer, we are able to comfort them by using the same comfort we have received from God. One of the biggest things that we hear about when we talk to people about end of life is, well, but the person's suffering. And don't you want to put them out of their misery? Why do you want grandma to suffer so badly? Have you ever read the book of Job? Have you ever thought about Jesus' passion? Do you think he suffered? In the Apostles' Creed, we talk about he suffered and was buried. Suffering, God uses suffering to draw us closer to him. He uses suffering for people who are ministering to the person who's suffering. I can't tell you the number of nurses that I've talked to who are so blessed by being able to minister to a person who is suffering. And they are drawn closer to that person, and so they are able to be blessed by that ministry that they're conducting, by them ministering to the person who's suffering. So we aren't to be afraid of suffering. It's part of life. I want to get a couple things straight before we get started. There's a difference between physician-assisted suicide, which is the main topic for this morning, and euthanasia. Euthanasia is the intentional killing by act or omission of a dependent human being for his or her alleged benefit. So this is a doctor or someone actively administering drugs to kill a person. When you have your dog put to sleep, the dog is being euthanized. Some other situations that we want to talk about, and I don't want to infringe on, I know Sheila talked about some of this stuff also, and you may have heard other topics or other discussions as well, but some situations that we want to draw a distinction on here before we get started. But this idea of pulling the plug, disconnecting respirators and those kinds of things. And there is absolutely a right time for this. I don't want you to think that you should never ever pull the plug on someone. There is absolutely a time when you are prolonging death rather than prolonging life. And so I want to make sure that you understand that. But we are not talking about this topic this morning. Another is ceasing hydration or ceasing nutrition for someone, removing feeding tubes or removing the saline solution. That's another completely different topic. To me, it is almost always wrong, although there are times when you will, if you have a feeding tube and you're providing nutrients to someone whose body has shut down already, you're actually doing more harm than good by providing food or nutrition or water that body cannot process. You're literally drowning that person. So there are times when this is absolutely the right thing to do, and these are case-by-case things, and we could talk for the rest of the day just on different individual cases. But you know about Terry Schiavo. That was a case where, to me, it was just absolutely killing her, because they removed hydration and food, and she died of dehydration. Her body was still processing the food and the water. So that's a whole different subject. But what we're here to talk about this morning is assisted suicide. And this is where Virginia will take over for a bit.
Okay. Thank you. I actually work on a coalition that Reverend Hinz alluded to last night at worship that deals with the physician-assisted suicide. We're now calling it assisted suicide, although today in all the states that have legalized this, it's a physician that's required to enact the suicide. So, suicide, when we talk about assisted suicide, is when someone provides an individual with the information, guidance, and means to take their own life. In physician-assisted suicide, of course, we talk about that's when the doctor is the one that assists by prescribing a lethal dose of medication. And it's just a little tidbit I like to add. It isn't just a matter of giving them a pill to take. You actually have to take 90 pills to die from this. So things can happen in the course of taking 90 pills, and in some cases, the family members or the person themselves, perhaps, if they're able, will put those pills in a juice, or they can drink, or they'll put it in pudding that they can eat, or something of that nature. So it's more than just the doctor assisting in some of these cases. It could be family members. What a horrible thing to know that you participated in killing a family member. Also, the only difference between assisted suicide and euthanasia is which person performs the final act. In the case of euthanasia, the doctor would inject a lethal drug and then the person would die. And in the case of assisted suicide, they're prescribing the medication that the person takes and dies from that. We have a particular instance here that may be familiar to some of you. You may have seen this before. We showed it last year, but it's worth seeing again. Dr. Maggie Karner was the head of the Life Ministries at LCMS Synod headquarters in St. Louis, and she has a story to tell, and so we're going to let you listen to that.
It's scary, and it knocks the breath out of you. It takes a long time to come to terms with a disease, especially a terminal illness. And then you start thinking, okay, this is a new me, this is the new normal, and I can still appreciate every moment. I'm Maggie Karner, and I'm 51. I live in Bristol, Connecticut. I'm married to a wonderful spouse, and I have 3 beautiful daughters. I was diagnosed last April, about almost a year ago, with aggressive brain cancer. It's called glioblastoma. The first round of treatment was chemo and radiation, and I did really good for a while, and then now the cancer cells have come back and the tumor is starting to grow again. Here on the mantle I have kind of my little collection of family pictures. This is my mom on her wedding day. This is my dad, my hero dad. My dad was always very active, and toward the end of his life he had a spinal cord accident which made him a quadriplegic. That was a really rough transition for him, and all of us were just heartbroken to think of how is Dad going to exist without the use of his arms and legs. Initially, our attention to him and our willingness to be with him all the time, I think, was hard for him because there was nothing he could do in return. But I think he settled into it very gracefully, and he realized the value of the words that were being spoken, and we learned a lot. It was a gift that my dad gave to us because he spent that time with us. I saw with my own 2 eyes what joy can still be found in just valuing every moment. It doesn't mean it's going to be great, doesn't mean it's going to be romantic, but there are moments that are valuable. that need to be cherished. And here I am years later after my father's death, and my siblings and I still talk about those moments. He left us a legacy of that time that he gave us. He could have checked out right away and said, I'm done with this. But he didn't. He stuck around and he said, I'm here for you. And so my dad showed me not just how to live and how to do stuff and how to be productive. He showed me how to die with grace and dignity.
So, Maggie was on the staff at LCMS Life Ministries in St. Louis, and we miss her dearly. We had a wonderful relationship with her, and as a result, we move on. And she wanted her message to be that, as we hear in the other states through this group called Compassion and Choices, who is supporting physician-assisted suicide, they chose that word compassion. There's no compassion and there is no death with dignity, which is what they promote in wanting this. So, tell you a little bit about euthanasia in particular that Reverend Licht talked about. We have it legal in 4 countries. It is illegal in Luxembourg. Nobody knows that because nobody knows where it is. The Netherlands, lots going on in the Netherlands in this arena. In Belgium, and in Belgium it is like the worst case possible. They actually, on February 13th, 2014, legalized the death of injection for children. And they fulfilled that a couple months ago by actually killing a child. So it's a little frustrating and sad. Parents must agree to this, but there's so much pressure going on how this is something that they should be doing that obviously someone has already consented. And it's a problem because when this starts, it's kind of like it's contagious, which I will talk to you a little bit about. It's also in Canada. As of last year, their Supreme Court legalized it. It wasn't a law, but it became a law when the Supreme Court did legislation like we talk sometimes happens in this country. And so it became legal as of February 2015. We're not far from Canada here in Minnesota. My guess is some of you are pretty close to Canada. And you don't even have to be close to access it. So we have physician-assisted suicide in 6 countries, in Switzerland, in Germany, in Albania, in Colombia, in Japan, and 6 states within the United States. And I'll tell you who they are. Oregon, of course, is who we talk about a lot. And they are like the poster child of suicide. In fact, we put this note up here that because physician-assisted suicide is accepted there, they have a 49% higher rate of suicide than the national average in people not using physician-assisted suicide. It is a way of life. And that's a sad commentary on what's going on because other states are following. Washington, just like Oregon, they follow the same. Everybody's copying everybody's laws. They all are very, very much the same. Montana isn't a law in Montana, but they had a court mandate with a case that went through, and they consequently have the ability to do it. They just haven't really done it. There are issues in Montana with laws that don't protect doctors in the civil court, so they haven't prescribed it. And every time they have something to vote on, they try to get that in there, the folks that support it, and try to get the doctors protected, and consequently, it just hasn't happened, so praise the Lord. It's also legal in New Mexico, but only in one county, and as a result of that, there's so much pressure through the rest of the state, even that county. And again, that was done through a judge, not through a vote. And consequently, because of that, it has kind of had a little different view, I think, by the folks in New Mexico. And Vermont is another state that has it. And California is probably the one that you heard the most about. And if you've heard the talk about Brittany Maynard, she became the poster child when she, at a very early age in her life, talked about physician-assisted suicide and how she needed it. She actually had the same brain tumor as Maggie Carner. And Maggie did try to communicate with her and was unsuccessful to try to convince her that that's not something she should do. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Minnesota, because we had a bill that was ready to go into, it was at a Senate hearing back in March, and if you go to Reverend Hins's workshop, he'll probably talk about this too, I'm not sure. It was presented to the Senate committee, and if it passed the Senate committee, it would have gone on to the Senate for a vote. Well, that particular day, we happened to belong to a coalition here in Minnesota, and the coalition got together, and because we knew that the group Compassion and Choices was going to be there, they tried to keep it secret, but the word got out. And they brought in Brittany Maynard's husband to help meet senators and really promote this bill getting to the Senate floor. So we had a lot of people show up that day from our coalition, and bless the doctors and the nurses and the hospice care workers and those folks that came to testify against physician-assisted suicide. And one of the most powerful testimonies was a doctor from the palliative care department down at the Mayo Clinic. They get choked up about it because it was a very emotional day as we saw these sick people go to the front and say they wanted to kill themselves. But we also had equally sick people go to the front and said, please protect me from this happening against me. And so it was a very emotional day. So at the end of the day, the senator that wrote the bill withdrew it under the premise that we needed more education, and she would bring it back this next year. So we expect it to come back. Here are things that are wrong with physician-assisted suicide. And all these states copy each other, so they bring all those things to the new bills, even though they'll tell you we're going to fix it. There is no fixing in physician-assisted suicide. But these are some of the issues with it. Number one, it opens the door to doctor shopping. So if your doctor isn't in favor of this, and I'd ask him, by the way, even though we don't have a bill, in some of your states where it may be legal, I want to have a doctor. I had a discussion with my doctor a few weeks ago, and I had a physical, and he gave me a litany a mile long of why this is a bad thing. Well, I felt pretty good about going to that doctor. So I think you should ask the question. Doctor shopping is a bad thing, and I hope that Dr. Page talked about it, because you go to a doctor now who doesn't even know you. By the way, there's a place that opened up in California that now, for $3,000, you can go in and they'll prescribe the pills for you. They don't know you, they just want $3,000. So it's a new market that's opening up in the medical field. There is no witness required at death. If there's any foul play that goes on with those pills sitting in your medicine cabinet, no one's gonna know it. No safeguards once the legal drugs have been dispersed, and there's no paper trail. In fact, the death certificate says that the cause of death was cancer or some other form of illness that caused you to want this. And so there's no paper trail. You can't prove that you died from physician-assisted suicide, that somebody might have done something illegal. In fact, the papers are destroyed in 2 years. My doctor keeps his records more than 2 years. There's no required psychiatric evaluation. The doctor has to say, this person's depressed, they need to have an evaluation to make sure they're thinking correctly. They don't even know you if you've doctor shopped. How do they know if you're depressed? I'm going to ask you, and if you're going to say no, and that's the way it is. So it's a very unfortunate thing. And people, here's the thing. Suffering, you talked about suffering. One of the number one reasons that people in those states that have legalized it have said they wanted it, they don't want to be a burden to their family. It's a sad commentary if we don't have our family to protect us. So we talk about, in Oregon, 40% said they didn't want to be a burden, and 61% in the state of Washington in surveys that they did. Pretty high percentage. And suffering and depressed people deserve treatment and care, not killing.
Another thing that ties in that I want to just piggyback on with what Virginia was saying is that if physician-assisted suicide is available in a state, there's a lot of pressure that the person feels that, well, it's available. Maybe I should be taking that option. Maybe I'm depriving my family of something, or maybe Maggie Carner had talked about that she felt that if physician-assisted suicide was available in her state, that she would feel like this pressure was just on her to take her own life, that it was just expected. So, couple graphs here. This looks at how our society has changed its mind over time. This is asking the question that over time, if this was an option, should the person be allowed to partake of physician-assisted suicide? And so you look back all the way to 1947, and the vast majority of people said, well, no. 54% said no, you wouldn't want to participate in physician-assisted suicide. Now look how this is completely flipped around, though, over time. The latest statistics here are from 2006, and it's swung even further now to the side that people think that yes, they should be allowed to participate in physician-assisted suicide. Here's another graph that asks the question, and this is where it gets tricky, because how if you've participated in any polls, it's all in how you ask the question. And so if the question is asked, should you be allowed to end the patient's life by some painless means? Who doesn't want to die in some painless means? But when you ask the question like that, you get one result. When you ask the question, should the patient be allowed to commit suicide, you have a completely different set of answers. And so it's all in how you ask the question. At the Minnesota State Fair this year, the people from, they were sponsored by Compassion and Choices. They asked the question, should a person who is suffering be allowed to die with some painless means, or through some painless means? And so it was 67% or something like that was the response. That, well, of course, it's all in how you ask the question. So when it comes to your state, and it is coming to a state near you, be careful, read closely what's going on and what's behind the question. And then this is just some statistics on the number of times in Oregon that the prescription was written for the pills to carry out physician-assisted suicide. And so you'll see the exponential growth here. And as Virginia alluded to, that this we don't really know accurately how many people have carried through on this, because they list the initial diagnosis as the cause of death. They don't list physician-assisted suicide as the cause of death. And so it's really hard to get those accurate numbers.
The thing I wanted to just to mention about suffering. I have a personal experience with that. My mother was a diabetic, And over her course of her last 20 years, my guess is she was probably in the hospital about 2 to 3 times a year. And during that time, she went blind. Her kidneys failed. She was on kidney dialysis 4 days a week. She had her leg amputated. And yet, she was full of joy for the Lord. And one day, I walked into her hospital room, and she said, "Come here, come here." Lady next that was in the room with her was off getting tests, and she said to me, I got to witness to this lady today. She didn't know the Lord, and I got to tell her about the Lord. And we sat and talked about that a little bit, and we both decided that all this suffering, all these years when she wondered why she had to suffer so much, it was for that moment. And what I tell people is when we take our lives prematurely, what did you miss? Maggie lasted 1.5 years with her disease, at least 1.5 years before she passed on. And you would miss graduations, weddings, baptisms, family events, meeting new friends. All these things are so important in life. And so we have to be aware that we're not really helping someone when we're helping them take their life. And I know these people are suffering. Technically, you have to be diagnosed to die within 6 months without treatment. And most people would do that without treatment. A diabetic would qualify for that. Without insulin, my mother wouldn't have lived, 24 hours. So, needless to say, suffering, that's a bad way that it's being prescribed or told about, I guess, by Compassion and Choices, because they talk about death with dignity. There is no dignity in taking your own life. So the world's perspective is that death is the answer, and they talk a lot about the quality of life as being the measurement. That person doesn't have quality of life. Somebody in a wheelchair doesn't have quality of life. Why do it just isn't a value that we see. The diminished quality of life with the diminished bodily and mental functions would lead to the world removing the burden. There was an example in Oregon where the person was getting treatment, cancer treatment, and as soon as that bill was passed, the insurance company said, "We're not paying for that, but we'll buy you the $100 bottle of drugs." Now, I'm not going to say that's going to happen everywhere, but there was an instance where that did happen. But God has a different perspective on this. He created us. He values life because of His loving us so much that He created us. He sent His Son to redeem us when we didn't have hope because sin came to the world. And so through Jesus coming and redeeming us, we then had the promise of life. Why did He do that if He didn't love life? And through the waters of baptism, He's promised us eternal life. And He has called us into that relationship, and He wants us, and He values life. So for us as human beings to talk about destroying life by taking a bottle of pills just doesn't fit with God's plan. In John 10:10, I love this verse. I have it on my business card except for the first part. The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. And this is a slide that I know Barbara would have shown today because she gives us all this information constantly. In 2016, since January, there have been many, many states that have turned down these laws. And those states right now are where the bills have been defeated or the initiatives have been defeated were Arizona, Colorado, Hawaii, Iowa, Maryland, Nebraska, New Jersey, and Utah. These did not get through the legislature or they were turned down through the vote of the people. And so there is hope, a lot of hope. And other states like Minnesota had bills which, as I said, never made it to the floor, and that's so important. But I want to tell you about something that is happening in Minnesota, and I know it's happening in Iowa, maybe, and hopefully Reverend Licht will talk about that. But we have started a coalition here. What an amazing thing. All the faith-based communities, be it the Catholics, who, by the way, have been just wonderful. They understand the life issues. So do we. This is not an issue of a fellowship. This is not, it's an issue of life. And we see the value of life through our Lord and Savior, Jesus. And so we've started this coalition, and we also, it's not a coalition that's against physician-assisted suicide, although we don't want it. It's a organization called Minnesota Alliance for Ethical Health Care. We want better health care. We want better hospice care. We want better palliative care to remove some of that suffering that people, we will never totally remove all of that, but there's no reason that our legislatures and our should put their money towards physician-assisted suicide. They should be putting money toward positive things. So it's a positive organization that you're going to be hearing. If you're in Minnesota, you'll be hearing a lot about it really soon. It's going to be announced through press releases and websites, and the word will be out. But I want to, make it a point that we've got several people out here, Human Life Alliance, MCCL. Those folks have joined with this group to help work together. And MCCL, by the way, is the Right to Life in Minnesota. You all have right to lives in your states. And they've all gotten together, Pro-Life Action Ministries, the Catholics, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Lutherans. The Wisconsin Synod's involved because they have a Lutheran home down in Belle Plaine, Minnesota, and they're very worried with a bill like this that if it passed, their medical staff and their care workers would be forced to administer these pills to their patients. Very concerned, so they're very involved. And anyway, we have another message that Maggie was able to do before she passed away, specifically talking about physician-assisted suicide.
My name is Maggie Carner, and I was diagnosed with the same type of brain cancer as Brittany Maynard. When I was diagnosed, my doctor made sure I knew the general definition of glioblastoma, the high reoccurrence rate, and low survivability data. He explained to me that there is currently no cure for this aggressive form of cancer, and that it is a terminal diagnosis. But he told me to get busy and do the things now that I enjoy or that are meaningful to me. And thankfully, my doctor refuses to this day to speculate or give me a timeline on purpose, because he knows I'm an individual and every patient and every situation is different, and every person deserves the right to fight. Look, I know Brittany's videos were tragic and we all felt so sad watching them. But I know what Brittany faced, and honestly, suicide wasn't necessary. In fact, what really concerns me is that Brittany's suicide puts other patients like me at risk. Because the question of physician-assisted suicide isn't about me, it isn't about people with terminal illnesses, or any other individual patient. In reality, it ends up being about all of us. Please do not vote for this bill. You know what kind of a world we live in today. It's inevitable that vulnerable people will die without their consent through mistakes and abuse. No so-called safeguard can prevent this from happening. Voting for this bill is like putting fire in a paper bag, and it can't be contained. This bill puts patients like me at risk by opening the door to influence vulnerable people to commit suicide with state approval. Don't let the emotions of dying experienced by some overshadow the value of living for the rest of us. Please understand that the suicide of one patient doesn't end just there. It flows out into society and promotes the wrong idea that medical care is an overdose of suicide pills. There are better ways to shape public policy in order to care compassionately for those who are nearing death. Helping people die well shouldn't require changing the law so that other people are put at risk. So please remember patients like me who don't want to commit suicide, but instead want our right to live out our days without the risk of abuse or the subtle pressure
to comply with state-sanctioned suicide.
Okay, last slide. And just that is that our prayer is that together we can stand for the value and dignity of all human life, from the youngest to the oldest, the preborn to the elderly, the weakest to the strongest. Jesus said, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me also. You know, we all here, I don't, you know, we're kind of preaching to the choir, right? But how do you answer the question out in the public square of, well, okay, that's fine. You don't have to commit suicide. You don't have to avail yourself of physician-assisted suicide, but don't you dare tell me how to live my life. If I want to be able to have that ability, then I should have that right to have that ability to avail myself of this. So how do you answer that question? And I think Maggie just did, to a large extent. I think she did a wonderful job of talking about this suicide contagion, is what they call it, that if you as a society say, well, yeah, it's okay for you to commit suicide in this case, but how can you then turn around and say, well, but it's not okay to take a gun and take your own life, or to hang yourself, or so where at some point we still have to take back this societal morals and the right and wrong in society. And I think that is absolutely the purview of government, is to be that moral compass for the society. We've abdicated that long ago, but that would be my answer. But I'd be interested if other people have answers. And it's certainly something that you will be asked if you take a stand on this as well.